Welcome to Roots of Representation, a podcast series brought to you by Knology, a leading organization creating practical social science for a better world. The podcast series is a part of our larger National Science Foundation funded project called Black Rep for Kids, where we delve into the power of storytelling in helping young Black children prepare for and tackle the challenges of climate change. If you're interested in learning about how we can build a brighter climate future for Black children, their families, and their communities, you've come to the right place. Let's get started with Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds. I'm your host, Ed Greene, and I'm thrilled to take this journey with you as we collectively discover ways to increase and improve the representation of Black voices, characters, and stories in children's climate change media. Our guest for this episode is Dr. Iheoma Iruka. Dr. Iruka is a developmental psychologist and a research professor of public policy at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She is also the founding director of the University of North Carolina Equity Research Action Coalition at the renowned Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute. Much of Dr. Iruka's work is devoted to understanding the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of Black children and to developing policies, systems, and practices that advance racial equity in a variety of educational settings, including the creation of Black-owned and Black-led early childhood programs and organizations. One of her most recent publications is We Are the Change We Seek: Advancing Racial Justice in Early Care and Education. This co-authored book helps teachers and education leaders devise new classroom methods and strategies for advancing learning among children from racially and ethnically minoritized communities. Dr. Iruka, welcome to Roots of Representation.
All right, I'm so glad to be here. How exciting to be talking with you, Dr. Greene.
Absolutely, and we're happy to have you here and to get a chance to talk with you. So we've invited you to share insights from your research into the structural inequities that racially and ethnically minoritized groups face in their communities and how this is impacting their health and well-being. And in particular, we're interested in hearing about how this research connects with topics related to climate and environmental justice, and about how we might design opportunities for environmental learning and representation in story worlds that foster humanity, joy, and healthy identities for Black children and other children from minoritized groups. So to start off, we'd like to ask about your work. Tell us how you came to it, what inspires it, and how it intersects and deals with some of the discussions we're going to have around climate and environmental justice.
Yeah, oh my gosh. So what a great question, a full and thorough question. It could take us hours and hours, but I will keep it brief. I would say, I first say that I am a child of Black immigrants from Nigeria. So, and I was born in Texas. And so I feel like part of my sort of diasporic roots, I think, really present itself in many ways. That yes, I grew up in poverty in Boston. I'm a single parent. I'm one of 7 girls. And so I feel like I come sort of with this sort of earnest energy to always want to represent my people, my name, my family, and those who really created spaces for me. So I'm always trying to figure out, how do I make sure I'm doing the best work? And really, most importantly, I grew up in a space where I had a lot of great friends. And a lot of them, I think we have different bifurcated outcomes. And I always want to know, like, why is it that we all came out from single parent households for the most part? We're all Black, living in the poor side of Boston, Massachusetts. And I was like, what happened? What went wrong or didn't go right, et cetera. And so for me, I'm always on a journey of what happened and how could we sort of figure that out. And I think my journey took me on sort of roads of unlearning. Because I think I started with, like, what's wrong with that kid? What's wrong with that family? What's going on over there that y'all didn't get it right and we got it right over here? And so it took me on this journey of unlearning that is not about blaming individuals and families, but that there's certain things structurally at work because a lot of my friends who did not quote unquote make it, and I use that term quote unquote, were mostly the Black boys who we all came in together in seventh grade through, high school, and they all left. A majority of them left or were kicked out by at least eighth or ninth grade and went to an alternative school. And so I think for me, my journey really went through a process of having to unlearn that sort of narrative and fallacy that there's something wrong with our people, and really figuring out, what are the roots of the issues that does not blame folks. And so, obviously through all of that, it really required me to sort of relearn the history of our country, the way stratification of opportunities happen. And even if you have the best things, like, I'm one of seven girls, as I said, and a lot of my brothers died before or after birth. And I think about the issue of many Black women who are educated, well off, are likely to either die during childbirth or likely to lose a child, in the first year of life, not because they didn't go to prenatal, didn't do all the things, but because the toxicity of racism, discrimination lives within sort of that fetal environment and leads to all these sort of poor birth and health outcomes. And compare that to white, women who may not have a degree and are better off, right? So really, to me, the issue of environmental justice connects the issues of health justice, economic justice, and social justice. And so I think my work is really rooted on how do we make sure that children and families are protected from harm, adversity, hardship, but also how is their health and their wealth and access to educational excellence promoted? But then how do we preserve their culture, their family, the institutions like HBCUs, how we preserve those institutions and those communities, because that is underlying who they are, their racial and cultural identity. So for me, I call like the three Ps, right? How do we make sure that all the three Ps of protection, promotion, preservation is fully there? And so that's really my journey that I am still on.
I love it. I really appreciate also the fact that we're able to bring this African diasporic approach to our conversation, because it brings the conversation to yet another level. So, how do you see, in conjunction with some of the institutions, and you mentioned HBCUs, but how can institutions like HBCUs and other of the Black-owned, Black-led organizations that you've studied help advance some of the things we're going to talk about in terms of climate and environmental justice? And I'm particularly interested in freedom towns. I've read
Yes,
some things
yes,
that you've been
yes,
involved in there.
yes,
So how do you see
yeah,
these
yeah.
involved in this environmental justice and climate justice work?
So let's be blunt about it, folks, right? Like, our historically Black colleges and universities, our HBCUs, our Black-owned organization and institutions have been systematically and historically underfunded, right? And they were created specifically because we were excluded from economic and academic opportunities. So they were created for a purpose, and also for to liberate us in many ways and know who we are. And so even though they were and continue to be severely underfunded, even here in North Carolina, we have universities that are not able, I literally tell students, go home, St. Augustine, go home, because we can't pay the bills, right? Because they have been severely underfunded. So we have to keep that in mind. But even with that level of underfunding compared to predominantly white institutions, they continue to sort of be the ones to sort of call up and make sure that we have well-trained doctors, scientists. They still graduate the sort of the number one sort of medical, professionals, scientists in our country. Right? So to me, I think the more that they continue to ensure that the academic world is filled with Black people who are rooted in both truth, but also history, but also culture from the diaspora, the better our work and our impact of policy and practice will be. So to me, their job is to continue doing the job that they have already been doing, right? Which is to continue to make sure that we are always going to be there. We may only make up 2% because that's just, it costs money to educate folks, right? But the fact that they continue to produce a massive amount of our various educators in various fields. And so I do think they have to continue to do that. I think that they also have to continue to figure out how do we make sure that a lot of our other institutions, again, our white institutions, who oftentimes leverage a lot of their collective expertise, whether in terms of their intellectual property knowledge, or even the individuals who come out of HBCUs and then matriculate into predominantly white institutions, is that they have to continue to ask them and make sure that they are also included in any of the research work being done, right? That they're included in any kind of sort of production of intellectual materials that eventually gets marketed, right, and economized, right? So I think we have to continue to make sure that they are getting rewarded for all of the work that they have been done historically and presently. So I think that's something that we can do. The same thing with sort of Black owned, organizations and also businesses, that we personally have to invest in them. So I think that we can't continue to ask our HBCUs, our Black owned institutions to continue to do more when we're paying them basically pennies or a dollar. That means that we as a community have to also invest in them, right? That means that we have to engage with them, partner with them, whether as research, make sure that we're also, putting our dollars there, right? We know from the evidence that we have that dollars that enters the Black community leaves in like 7 to 10 seconds, right? Compared to in other communities where they stay for weeks and months, right? And so we have to figure out how to make sure that we are actually spending our dollars in our Black organizations and in our Black institutions. And that just requires us to do more work to make sure that we are aware that they're out there, right? So that's where social media and other kinds of media can help us do that. The more, and I think that they're going to be important because I think the fight for environmental justice is going to require a lot of truth telling, right? Just like when we think about economic justice issues and social justice issues, we need really truth tellers, but those who are also willing to say we have answers here, but we also know how to sort of stand against what is likely to be misinformation and disinformation. And so I do think that part of what we need to make sure we shore up is how to make sure that the information that's coming out that we can help ensure that it is insulated and supported. And that requires us to really make sure that we have a strong, vibrant coalition of our Black owned and Black led institutions and organizations, especially on these kind of issues. Because I think as more resources are needed, there's going to be a fight about who deserves it. And oftentimes, sadly, the Black community, Black people, we tend to do all of the work, but we also don't tend to get the equitable resources and funding that we need to make sure that we get what we need.
Well, I'm glad that you're raising this. And as I was preparing for our time together, and you always provide a pathway for future learning, I discovered something that hopefully we'll get a chance to talk to on another time, but I'll share right now, the HBCU Green Fund. I had never heard of it. And it was because I was preparing for this podcast and because of the provocations you had given in your prep for this, it really forced me to begin to look. So I think what you're saying is critically important. And I'm learning more about the work of the HBCU Green Funds, which is being developed to help HBCUs to become sustainable institutions, but also how do you raise the funds to make sure that that happens as well. So thank you for continuing to push for many of us to pay attention to what's going on, and we'll talk more about that. But through your research, what are you seeing as the most serious impacts of, let's say, climate change on children and families? Are there any
Yeah.
particular things that jump out at you?
Yeah, there's a lot, right? So when we think about sort of climate change, it has different, when we think about it, it has different legs. People think climate change, they probably think flooding, they think fires, all devastating, can impact, anybody, whether you're Black, white, Latino, et cetera. So, right. So it can impact you just in terms of devastating, your home, where you live, maybe where you work, your community writ large, right? So it has just that devastation, but I think when we think about Black people sort of specifically, and you reference, some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues here around the Freedom Towns, and it's even more devastating for our communities, particularly Freedom Towns. And for those who don't know, right, these are towns that were really created for the first enslaved people, and we have it across the country, particularly obviously in the South. From here in North Carolina, we are studying one Ironton over in Louisiana, right? And so a lot of times, similar to how we treated the natives, there are lands that are, low, sea levels. They're not really habitable. And so they're often prone to flooding, really, and other kinds of sort of devastating sort of environmental consequences. So that also means that those communities, the land where, cemeteries, right, where our communities, our families and ancestors live and are buried, are washed away. And that's really devastating on both a physical level, but also on sort of an emotional and cultural level, right? When really the land, the only thing you have from when you were really quote unquote liberated is now really gone because of human and man-made sort of decisions, and you're the one suffering it. That has really impacts, right? That means now that children can't really go back and trace their history. And we already know the impact of not being able to trace your history. That means that somebody gets to tell you what your history is, right? They get to tell you your own history is being in bondage and be chattel slave, an enslaved person, right? That's your history. They don't tell you your history really starts from really brilliant minds of kings and queens, but really brilliant minds, those who started medicine, who started math, who started art and all these things. They just get to tell you your history in a way that's bastardized. And so there's a loss of stories, there's a loss of family. And to me, that actually impacts the health and well-being of children, because now they don't have a tether, right? Think about just any one of us when the pandemic was happening and you couldn't sort of touch your loved ones. That had an emotional and then led to physical and physiological effects, right, of depression and many other things. And so imagine when your whole self is not tethered properly, that could actually unwind children in many ways that is usually unseen, because children don't have words, right? Children don't have words for certain things. They just have their bodies and their
Mm.
emotions. And sometimes we don't respond to those emotions and those body signals. It really could have continued devastating impact later on, right? It could lead to sort of inattention. It could lead to sort of emotional challenges, behavioral challenges. And then we sort of say, it's your fault, kid, that you're not paying attention, not passing the end of grade test. But that has really been seeped into their physiology, it's been seeped into their brain development, etc. The same thing with adults, right? Again, when you're not tethered and you're having sort of mental challenges, that could have impact on how you interact with your child, how you interact with society, how you sort of reach out to hope and cope, right? And so we have to really begin to understand how climate change has a physical and economic impact for sure. We also have to recognize that it has these other direct and indirect impact on just family function and family well-being, family cultural identity and sense of self, that then also has impact on children's well-being and obviously their school and sort of academic and cognitive and emotional well-being. And so I do think we have to really think about how climate change is not just this visible, visceral thing. It is, but it really could have consequences for Black children, especially who are likely to live in poverty, not have a lot of wealth, right? So when something devastating happens, like climate change, you don't have a whole bunch of wealth. Say, you know what, I'm going to pack up my stuff, pack up my people, and go over here, right? That, like, Hurricane Katrina. They weren't able to just leave, New Orleans, pack up and go. It was like, I have no money, I have no resources to just move, right? And so that's the same thing with climate change. And so when you're already economically vulnerable, it really creates a level of dissonance and a level of vulnerability that really impacts just families being able to function well, and then children themselves also being able to function well. And to me, again, we have to be careful that we don't blame children and families for what they're experiencing. Because again, for Black people that have been stratified and not provided with equitable opportunities for whether it's education, economic and wealth generation and all those things, and often positioned in places where they're likely to sort of live in communities that are vulnerable. They're also likely to experience environmental toxins. These compounded issues are not their fault. They were systematically designed in that way. And we have to make sure that we continue to work on how we repair, make those reparations, aka reparations and repair, and eventually really make sure that our children are doing well, right? So to me, they're all connected in different ways. It's not going to be a one sort of solution to address it.
You've opened the door to a part of this conversation that I think is critically important, because how we represent our stories, and I'm feeling this even more in our conversation, really is grounded in from whence we come and what has been experienced. And if that's not part of the story that we get to tell, then people don't really understand the connections that you were just describing. So in your work, you've illustrated some of the many ways that racism is harmful to health and well-being and the development of Black children. So to counter these harms, you've called for the creation of an anti-racist developmental science. So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's part of our roots of representation in creating story. What might anti-racist learning look like in the context of story worlds that
Yes.
address Black children's environmental education? I mean, I'm just throwing that out there as
Yes.
another twist.
Yeah, and I will connect the dots, and hopefully, I'll do it sort of quick for our listeners here, right? So science is important, right? People, hopefully, for most people, they trust science, because, right, hopefully, it leads to better lives and better outcomes and better economic, living, et cetera, right? But also, science has been part of really creating, ensuring that certain people were in bonds and chains, right? It sort of said, that certain people are subhuman, and so you are justified in being able to enslave them as animals, as properties, right? So we have to also be really cautious about science in many ways, and we see some of that coming back again. Eugenics, right, is making its way. Again, social media has goods and bads, and the bad is that some of the bad really characters begin to sort of have this place, as I will call it, to foment sort of their issues. But science, I think, can be really important, and for children, Black children, and our well-being, it's important that our science, really corrects itself, right? That our science shouldn't be about how do we fix those children, but how do we make sure that we understand the context that creates the disparities that we see, whether in academic outcomes or cognitive outcomes or whatever. We have to see it in context. And in our work, we created sort of a framework that we call the RISE framework, which stands for Racism and Resilience and Resistance Integrative Study of Childhood Ecosystem, because we have to recognize that racism has many forms, from cultural racism, like the water, the air that we breathe, right? Like we're fish, we're in the water, we don't even know, it's just there around us, right? And so the cultural racism that exists and the ideology of white supremacy that exists in everything, from the structural part, right, that we have segregated certain people to live in certain parts of our local spaces, and some of those spaces are not healthy, right? And because we see that in a lot of the things that we see with climate change, and so we have structured it in our policies in many ways, right? And then there's also the way that we interact, the interpersonal side of things, right? The kind of bigotry and bias and discrimination, and then there's the stuff that kids experience vicariously and internalize, etc. And so we call this work RISE. But also within this particular framework is the idea that, yes, let's recognize the impact and the pernicious impact of structural and many forms of racism and discrimination. Let's also recognize the resilience of our communities, of our families, of our children, right? In that we continue to see, Black families even thrive, even when they literally have no money, right? Even when we have our last dollar, we are willing to share it, right? We are willing to do that. But also the idea of resistance, right? People often think, and I hope that's not the case. They see us continue to fight, right? We're often resisting things, right? And some of the ways that we do that is the way that we language and communicate, right? So going into your storytelling, right? Part of the ways that we have often lived as a sort of African diaspora has been through our storytelling, which is one of the biggest strengths that our children actually have, is that I can tell my own kids, they would tell you a story and you're like, oh, okay, you put a whole lot of things together, that we call the linguistic capital. And so imagine if we're able to see the power of storytelling, the way we can create sort of these imagery of beauty, the way we can sort of, communicate in ways that gets you to move, that gets you to sort of feel that same thing in many ways. And I think the more we can see the power of that and the way that our children are, we can create a different kind of learning spaces and see them differently. And so I think part of what we talk about with developmental science is that make sure we talk about the context and the multiple ecological contexts that children are living in, and how racism permeates all of that all the time in different ways. But also recognize the family and cultural assets that children have from their linguistic capital, from their family capital, right? The fact that we have different ways of being a family, right? From our biological families to our community families to our kin and kith folks, right? Even the way we navigate spaces that are created for us, and even our spiritual capital, and the way the church and spiritual spaces has really been our bastion of liberation in many instances, right? And so to me, it's important that we really begin to talk about those systems that create inequities, but also talk about the ways and the gifts that we get to have as a Black community. And I think that's where the freedom Town, I think, as much as we talk about sort of the devastation of climate change, I think what we also have to recognize is the beauty that comes when you're creating a space that honors who we are, that honors our history, that just shows the resilience and the resistance of our people, right? From the kind of songs that are created, the kind of stories that are told, that continues to affirm the beauty of our skin and of our hair, of our intellectual curiosity and intellectual ability. And so for me, I think we have to continue to ensure that science is able to see that beauty and not sort of continue to maintain a narrative that does not fully humanize our children, does not fully humanize our family, and fully humanize our community in the way that we continue to be resilient, but also resistant in the face of oppression and really inequitable opportunities and access.
I think some key areas that can be used to help guide how we tell our stories is first to know that there is this linguistic capital that you talked about, and that there are multiple contexts that we draw from, including different ways of being family. And when I think about that, and think about some ideas for, for for storylines that could be put into a picture book, just about how people are interacting with each other, but building on that linguistic capital, I think is really important. So how can we design early learning spaces that foster that humanity and justice and joy for Black children, particularly, and in connection with how we're talking about this overall approach to climate and multiple ways of looking at that?
Yeah, young children are such. One of my good colleagues talks about scientists, Ani, over at Northwestern, right? Which is the idea that children are always soaking things in, and so it's an important time, sensitive period of development for children to soak things in. So I think the way that we can continue to do that is make sure that our curriculum and pedagogy, I think, is not this sort of race neutral, which I don't think there's such a thing as race neutral. Even in early child, they think that they're race neutral. They're really not, right? There's a pedagogy. It's just you may not call it what it is, which is white, white dominant, English dominant, etc. And so I would say that part of it is to sort of look through how do we make sure that we represent sort of the Black community, right? Even talking about freedom towns, right? And talk about the kind of land that they're on, right? We can go to many parts of our country and see sort of what is the ecosystem around them? Who are the people like, right? So there's a lot that you can do a whole curriculum set on just sort of that notion in many ways. So I think part of it is to make sure the representation of these towns is there, right? So children, because the thing about your early age is that things are imprinted, and the more you imprint information of critical value, of cultural relevance to children, they may not speak it all the time, but it stays with them into adulthood, right? So I think one of those is to really think through our curriculum, think through our materials, right? Think through what are we sharing with children, and it's not just for Black children, right? Because again, as we continue to say every single year, especially in Black history is America's history. And to me, anything that really fosters our knowledge, our value, a celebration of Black communities is really a celebration of American history, right? Again, good or bad, it's not my job to sort of rewrite stuff, but it's just to tell the story. So I think one way we could do that is really through, the curriculum, the storytelling of that. The other thing is that we know that, outdoor learning is one that we don't think a lot about. People don't think outdoor learning, think about, Black and brown kids. But I do think we have to think through, right, in many other parts of the globe, right, the outdoor is kind of your learning space, right? That is like kids have eyes, they can see for them, a lot of, again, exceptional for those, children who may have certain sort of physical and other kinds of disabilities, is that we have to also say, are there ways to ensure that kids are going out there, not just to play? Yes, go out there, play, get your physical, activity up. But I think we have to also give them a sort of a value of the land, right? Think about how Native and Indigenous sort of people think about the land. And even when you go to sort of African countries and even other countries across the globe, like in Asia, there's a lot of respect of the land, looking at the plants, at the trees, how they get here, looking at the soil, right? Again, it builds brain. It also encourages them to think about science, right? And other things in many ways, right? So you're building all this intellectually stimulating learning. And I think being able to talk about the land and what it is, how do you grow crops on the land, right? How is it that we are able to grow cotton grow rice, right? Especially if not indigenous to America, right? So I think to me, being able to sort of begin to engage in sort of outdoor learning, I think could be really helpful. The other thing we could talk about is even sort of environment and sort of we talk a lot about recycling kind of around children, but we never talk about the different kinds of materials that we use and have them do experience about if you have this kind of plastic, how does it disintegrate? Where does it go? Right? Even talk about landfill. So I think that we can begin to sharpen and shape children's mind to just think about the land, think about the way we treat the land, think about the history of the land and how it came to be, and look at how different land that you're around, what are the foliage around it, right? How do we treat it? When you go out to your own community, do you see trees or do you just see concrete? And what do you think that does in terms of heat rising and all that? So I think that early learning could be such a special place to have children be curious, to really engage with the physical land, to also engage with all the things around them and the weather that they also are experiencing. And I think the more we can kind of introduce those things, we can also, that allows us to introduce STEM, right? That allows us to kind of expand their learning, expands their language, right? Because now even children who may say speak a different language or a different kind of language system like African American English, it doesn't matter, right? It's about now we can actually communicate in ways that we can touch, we can feel, we can kind of examine a deeper way. And so I think it actually allows children, regardless of their language, of their disability, that they begin to really engage because now they can feel it, think about it, question it, and really go into that more of that what we call intellectually stimulating sort of higher order thinking process. And I think the more we can do that, the more they could be the solvers, again, the continuous solvers of clearly what will be a continuing issue around climate change.
What you've also done, I think, is to help us to realize that children are a part of a developmental continuum,
Right.
and their concrete experiences initially are learning about things that are in their environment, things that they can label, things that can identify, even with their families. So I think that that's important to keep in mind, especially as we're creating materials for younger children and helping them to be able to acquire the language and skills that allow them to describe what they see and what they know. And I'm really, really glad that you brought that particular piece up, because too often there's a lot of attention on quote the science, whether or not we can talk about the adaptations that we need to make. But if you don't first understand what it is that we're talking about in nature and what nature represents, and I think there was a early writer who had talked about the fact that we should be careful and ensure that children have a chance to love the land, love the earth, love what's around them before we ask them to cure the ills of the world and the earth. And I think you've helped to reinforce that part as well. So can children's media help children sort of deal with the risks of climate change? I mean, I think you've already talked a little bit about how we can prepare them. We can give them access to being able to the language they need to describe what they experience. But as they get older and are cognitively ready to think about things that have to do with harm, or repair, what are the things that we can do to get them ready for these risks?
Yeah, no, I feel like there's so much, right? And I do want to just expand, right? I think about, the idea that like my son, he's been thinking about recycling since he was 4, right? He was just fascinated with like the idea of like the trash truck, the recycler truck. Like he was just, he was fascinated with that part of it. And then he started discovering, oh, I see now what they do. And so when he's like in a car, he's like, oh, mommy, did you see that paper on the ground? I said, like, so I do think kids are conscientious. And I think when we provide the space, they can do it pretty early. But I think that, and so that means that kids are influenced by many, many things. And I think, as much as we're like, oh, don't put media in front of kids and all that. I mean, kids are going to see it. We're on our phones, we're on our tablets, we're on our computers. And I do think that we have to have an adaptive relationship with sort of issues of media and children as well. My kid was in Zoom school for a year, and here I was like, don't use your tablet, but we're like, fine, stay on it for 5 hours. So the dissonance of that doesn't make sense. But either way, I do think that there's such a powerful role, and we see, whether it's Fred Rogers' Neighborhood, we see Sesame Street, we see books, we see apps. I think media has a place, just like I think books have and they all have a place where, because children are going to be influenced, right? And of course, we believe that the most influential person in a child's life is their caregiver, their parents, of course. But we also have to be just blunt and realistic that, these other spaces could be also critically important, but we need them to also make sure that they're providing, factual information, they're providing critical information in ways that are adapted for children, right? So again, even simply being able to introduce children exactly to like terms, or be able to sort of allow children to kind of explore different sort of ideas about, what is this sort of foliage? What is this kind of land? And, how does heat rise, right? Why do we have rainstorms more in this period of time versus other period of time? Right. So I think that, and the media, I think, can make it in a way that is accessible for children, even for children, say, who may speak a different language, children who may have certain kinds of sensitivities to different kinds of stimuli. So I think that the media has a lot of different opportunities, right, to make it accessible, for children to even engage and see other places that they normally wouldn't have. Like, think about a kid, for me, my kid living here in North Carolina and being able to see things happening in Taiwan. Like, to me, that without having to get on a plane for 16 hours, right, and because it costs money, right? So being able to see things and learn things, right, and so they can have this global connection, right? Because climate change doesn't exactly sort of say, I'm going to be over here. Like, it impacts us as a global world. And so being able for them to understand how other people are living, how the land that they're on is sort of being activated, and how it may be harmed, I think is important. And then I think, in terms of addressing the harm, I think we can exactly prepare children to, I think they need that foundational understanding, right? And they also need to have their own understanding from their own perspective, right? Be able to interact with it in the way that fits for them. And then I think that as they discover that this world makes my food, it's also part of making sure that I'm healthy. It's also part of making sure that I can live, my family can live, right? I think if they understand that it's a dynamic living organism, the more they appreciate that, to me, and we can institute, I don't want to say institute it, but that they can actually understand it early on, the more that I think they would have a deeper appreciation for the things that they can do, whether professionally and also personally, right? Because yes, you can say, I want to do this as my job, but imagine if you're committed to protecting the land, the world that you're a part of, and it's part of who you are internally, is internalized so deeply that that's what you live for and live and focus on and are motivated by, that a lot of your decision making will be based on that. I think doing that early helps to sort of ensure that it's stained in children, so that now they can be part of protecting it in a way that I think at least hopefully would sustain it, right? So again, but it cannot happen if we don't give them that foundation. I think that media, including books that tell stories, that tells the stories of the value, that tells the stories of how it's lived and how other communities and cultures think about land, I think could really help sharpen their understanding, sharpen their language. For example, I think about the Eskimos. Like, when we think about the Eskimos in Alaska, and they have like, what, 252 different ways of saying snow, right? So imagine if our kids have hundreds of ways to talk about like the land and how to protect it and the water and all the things around them. The more they have that richer language, the more that they can actually do something when it comes to sort of repairing.
That is critically important, and I'm so glad that we're incorporating the developmental context of how children learn and how they grow across, periods of time and experiences. So I'm going to get a little provocative here and ask you, what's the thing you'd most like to talk about with other individuals working to increase and improve Black representation in children's climates, materials and
Yeah.
media? So what would you like to talk to them about? Pull
Gosh, I
them
mean,
aside.
yeah, I feel like, for me, I feel like what I would love to make sure they talk about is how do we make sure that our history is embedded in this work? Because I think, there's environmental justice, scholars, researchers, policymakers, etc. And oftentimes I think that's great. But I think that there's something to be said when we don't talk about the history of the land, even how we came to be here. For those who were in bondage and when they got here, those who were here before the lands were taken from them, right? So for me, I hope that part of those books really also tell a story about the land and the people. Because I think that to me, justice in many ways, to me, environmental justice issues, to me, are tied into, economic justice, to racial justice and social justice. And to me, part of the justice cannot happen if you don't know, hence the harm you have caused. In many instances, we have caused harm and still cause harm now. And so for me, I want those storytellers to and children book writers to figure out, how do you tell that story in a way that children can really lean into it and be curious, and it begins that journey for them about the land, but also about the history and how this land has been, was, how Black, enslaved people toiled on the land, and then was promised land that would not be given, and all this, and right. So they tell them a fuller, richer story that doesn't. To me, sometimes environmental justice just talks about land, but almost removes it from people, removes it from history, removes it from the devastation of attempted eradication of natives and enslavement of Black people. And so for me, for me personally, I hope that we don't continue to, separate those things. And so I would love to tell them, tell me a story that brings in the land, but also at the same time, tell me a story about joy, right? About how families, even in the midst of devastation, the land helped to fortify them. The land helped to give them voice. The land helped to give them freedom and power, and hopefully a little bit of wealth, right? So for me, I hope they could tell the story of pain, but also tell the story of joy, right? Because we don't always want to just talk pain, because even during the midst of pain, some of us, even when we're crying, we're laughing like, hyenas, right? So for me, it's critically important that they're able to tell that sort of juxtaposition story of the pain, but also the joy. And to me, storytellers, that's really what I hope. And the imagery can show that the depth of the land, the depth of the foliage. And so being able to communicate that historical legacy and what it looks like today, to me, would be hugely important.
Thank you for that. You said it in a way that really touched me, because bringing those things together do actually provide the roots for representing who we are. And so you hit it on the head for me. So before we let you go, we wanted to ask if there are any individuals or resources or groups contributing to this environmental or climate discussion that you'd like to share before we leave. Any particular ideas or people that you think we might want to pay attention to?
Gosh, I definitely feel like we should pay attention to, the work that we're doing here, really around Freedom Towns. But I'd say more specifically, let's pay attention to what is happening with the various Freedom Towns across our country, and understanding how climate change is having some irreparable sort of harm, right, to those communities, and it has, different threads, so you can't be able to come back, right? So I think let's figure out how, and how are we responding as a community, and how's the federal government responding, right? We have, we are supporting other nations to get stronger when things happen. And so we also want to make sure that we're looking at our own federal government, say, how are you supporting Freedom Towns who have a huge legacy in many ways, and how are we supporting them? So I definitely say let's continue to sort of look at what those towns continue to do, but also how our federal government is responding, but also how those state governments that they're in are responding. I would definitely say let's continue to make sure that we look out for our HBCUs, who I think in the end of it, right, a lot of them are in southern states, clearly, right? And we have to continue to figure out, how do we make sure that they're also really part of the conversation, but they're also fully funded to be part of the conversation and the action, right? Don't continue to ask, our institutions to do more and more when we continue to see that they do not have the funding to be able to do the kind of work that we know we need, right? But they can't do that just because we want them to, right? So I think those are two things I definitely want to highlight for sure. And then finally, I want to continue to highlight that we want to continue to call out civil rights communities, whether it's from our NAACP, our National Urban Leagues, right? All of them, that this issue is our issue, right? These are connected issues to economic justice, racial justice, social justice, that this issue is going to harm us the most. We have seen it already from, the global pandemic, right? That's an environmental issue, right? All of these harm us the most. And so we need them to also be at the table. So I encourage us to call on them to ensure that they are paying attention to these issues, and not sort of It may not be the sexiest issues, but these are the issues that we're either say that we're either going to survive or not, and that we're going to thrive or not. So we have to make sure that they're also really paying attention to it.
Wow. Well, you've provided us with some essential information and some homework that we need to do to think about as we're building the STEM-related knowledge into children's climate change literature and hands-on experiences. But there's a connection across all of these that are very much associated with what we're trying to do with the Black Rep for Kids project. Dr. Iruka, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you so much for having me and for creating this platform. I'm so honored to just be talking with you, Dr. Greene. I'm just so honored for those who are listening. And let's continue the work. It doesn't stop here. We have to continue to do it. So thank you for allowing me to grace this airwave.
Well, we're glad you're here. And there will be links to resources that you've shared on our Black Rep for Kids website. So we're going to make sure that we have links and other information for people who are watching the podcast to follow up. And we look forward to continuing this conversation with you about the project. So I want to thank each of our podcast followers for being with us and exploring roots of representation. Black-centered climate story worlds for young minds. That's it for now. I'm Ed Greene. Thanks for listening to Roots of Representation. If you'd like to comment on this episode, please head over to blackrepforkids.knowledge.org. Our website also contains free resources and more information about the project, which is led by Knowledge in collaboration with the Highlights Foundation, the National Black Child Development Institute, the Association of Children's Museums, and a panel of nationally recognized advisors. Remember, Black Rep for Kids isn't just a podcast. It's an essential part of the project's culminating experience, which will be a 2-day unconference event held in fall 2024. Head over to the website to register now. And in the meantime, let's keep the conversation going. You can also share your ideas and resources for amplifying Black voices and stories in children's STEM literature at blackrepforkids.knowledge.org. Roots of Representation is produced by ABF Creative, an award-winning podcast network that creates cultural and emotional connections through podcasts. The series is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advancing Informal STEM Learning Program under grant number 231-4101. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this podcast series are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Roots of Representation, the podcast centering Black climate story worlds for young minds.